Welcome back. Today we're discussing adaptation and natural selection, but before we get there, just give yourself a few seconds to settle in. Welcome back. Kind of want to just let that music play in the background. It's pretty nice. Okay, so moving into our next unit and starting with adaptation and natural selection. And we've already touched on natural selection. Now we're going to dig in and really learn more. So this first video is just sort of an overview and introduction. So some of this, may seem familiar. Let's see if I can there we go. You watched a video about the snake jaw and how the snake jaw works. And when you were watching that video, I hope that you sort of had a moment where you thought, like, holy cow, this is incredible. It's like this thing was engineered. The jaw walks itself up the prey. That is crazy. And the purpose of that is to point out how the snake's jaw, the ability of snakes to do that, is an adaptation. And the really cool thing, and the thing I would like you to kind of focus on, I mean, if you just want to be in awe of the snake jaw, I am so down with that. But in addition to being in awe of the snake jaw, and hopefully if you have a sort of like visceral ick snake reaction, even in the midst of that, can kind of be in awe of how cool nature can be. If we look at a phylogenetic tree, and this tree, there's a whole lot going on. I love this tree. I think it's beautiful. I've given you down at the bottom of your screen the DOI, and the DOI is a link, a direct link to this paper, if you'd like to go find it, and also just giving you the first author name and the year. You're probably already familiar with this, but et al. Means and others. So when a paper has a lot of authors, very often you'll see it abbreviated with the first author's last name and then et al. So reader and others. So reader and colleagues. This was published in 2015. If we look at this phylogenetic tree of snakes and lizards, so of course that's my thing. This was actually my home screen for a while. And we zoom in. Oh, maybe it's not going to let me do that. There we go. We zoom in. I know there's a lot going on over here with the branches of the tree. But if you look, you'll see that there are legless lizards up there at the top. Then we have geckos. Then we have skinks. Some more legless lizards. Then here we start getting into the snakes. So serpentes. And there's a little picture of a snake here, smack dab in the middle of this tree. So up here you have lizards. Now we go down here, more lizards. And if we zoom out and look at where snakes fit in this tree, right here, so this is the lineage, right, that lead to snakes. That is fully embedded in the lineages that lead to various groups of lizards. So we've got lizards up here, and we've got lizards down here. Snakes are lizards. And lizards don't have this ability to do that cool thing with their jaw. This is an adaptation that snakes evolved over evolutionary time to be able to eat large prey. And snakes are embedded within lizards, so the clade of snakes is embedded within a larger clade, within a larger monophyletic group of lizards. If we tried to take snakes out and make them their own thing, then we've created a paraphyletic group. And many of you I talked to in our meetings this week, a paraphyletic group doesn't make evolutionary sense. So snakes, this lineage, this clade that can do this cool jaw thing, this adaptation that looks like it's engineered, comes from a common ancestor that didn't have that ability. So this is an adaptation. This is an adaptation that evolved over time. Why is it not? You guys, there we go. All right, so that's one example of an adaptation. Another example of an adaptation that you're probably familiar with is cacti. So cacti are plants, but they've evolved, they've developed adaptation. They've evolved adaptations over the course of time to live in arid environments, so environments that don't have very much moisture. So they have things like needles instead of leaves, because leaves have this broad surface area, and you've probably learned in various classes that more surface area means more loss of moisture. So cacti have evolved to have needles instead of leaves, so they don't lose moisture because they live in arid environments. They've also evolved these sort of interesting shapes to store moisture in their bodies because they're in arid environments. So that's another example of an adaptation. Dolphins. If you remember when we looked at the phylogeny, where we were talking about that just because two things look the same doesn't necessarily mean that they are closely related. And dolphins and sharks, their body shape looks really, really similar. But dolphins are actually more closely related to hippopotamus, because dolphins share a common ancestor with land animals, and that ancestor was a land animal. Over evolutionary time, dolphins have evolved this shape that allows them to swim easily in the water. Cool. All right, well, that's all really, really cool and interesting. But those are all examples of evolution occurring over long evolutionary time. What I want to give you now is a couple of examples of evolution, of adaptations, changes in organisms over a period of time that we as humans have been able to document. You saw in an earlier video this happen in bacteria. That can happen super fast. Another example is the soapberry bugs. This is a picture over on the left of these soapberry bugs. Man, you guys, I don't know I have these everywhere. They're everywhere in my yard, in my house. Every day I sweep up, I don't know how many little soapberry bugs. And we call these in our house, very, very scientific term, we call these guys butt bugs. And you can see in this picture why we call them butt bugs, because when they're mating, they join their reproductive parts by their rear ends together and their heads opposite. And so they're always running around everywhere like this, where they're with their little butts stuck together. So we call them butt bugs. They're actually soapberry bugs. And they're called soapberry bugs because they feed on soapberry plants. And the reason they're such a cool example of rapid evolution is because of how they feed on these plants. So in Florida, these soapberry bugs evolved over long evolutionary time to feed on the seed pods. That's what this little green round thing is, the seed pods of a native plant in Florida. And so what they do is they insert this little structure here, it's yellow, they insert this structure called a beak into the seed pod, and they have to get it down to the seeds, and then they release digestive juices, and then they're able to feed on those seeds. So you can imagine for these soapberry bugs in Florida, this is their native plant seed pod that they feed on. It's big and it's round, and so they have these long beaks so that they can insert it and go down to the seeds, deliver those digestive juices, and then suck up the nutrients from those seeds. So it's useful for them to have these super, super long beaks. Apparently, these beaks are so long that they actually kind of have to unroll them when they're going to use them. I haven't seen that myself, but that's what I've read. Around 50 or so years ago, so around 1970, which in my mind, because of when I was born and when I was in high school, to me always feels like 30 years ago is 1970, but this was actually around 50-ish years ago that this happened. A non-native plant, closely related species of plant, was introduced. And that plant, it was introduced in Florida, has really small seed pods. So if you look at the seed pod on the left versus the seed pod on the right, and as invasive species do, this plant flourished. This really often happens with invasive species, and we'll talk about more about why that happens later in the semester. So this invasive tree became very prevalent, and in areas where this invasive tree became very prevalent, of course, the I want to call them butt bugs, the soapberry bugs, started feeding naturally on these seed pods because they're what's available. They're everywhere. And what happened is that over the course of time, this very, very long beak became short. So the soapberry bugs in Florida, over the course of less than 50 years, evolved much shorter beaks. Just over the course of 50 years. And this is an ongoing study. Research is coming out about this all the time. Evolutionary biologists are continuing to monitor this because this is an example of rapid adaptation. So the soapberry bugs in Florida, their beak size, so this arrow is representing a decrease in beak size. They didn't need those super long beaks anymore because they are adapting to feed on these much smaller seed pods. They're not these big, great, balloon seed pods that they evolved to feed on. So in less than 50 years, almost the entire population has adapted and they have shorter beaks now. Another thing that they're seeing is that the original soapberry bugs could fly. They could fly, that's a wing. But now, many, many, many are flightless. So in addition to adapting to feeding on the smaller seed pods, they've also lost their ability to fly. And the reason they've lost their ability to fly is because this introduced species, they all produce their seed pods around the same time in this cycle, rather than the seed pods of the native species being available kind of intermittently on different trees. And so it was advantageous previously for the soapberry bugs to be able to fly from tree to tree depending on which tree was producing seeds. But here, because they all produce seeds at the same time in this cyclical fashion, it's not useful for these soapberry bugs to be able to fly from tree to tree. They don't need to go, oh, I'm going to feed on this tree. Oh, now that tree is producing seed pods. I'm going to go over to that tree. All the trees are producing seed pods at the same time, and all of those trees already have soapberry bugs on them. So this is very rapid adaptation in less than 50 years. Interestingly, in Texas, the opposite is happening. So originally, the seed pods that the soapberry bugs were feeding on were quite narrow, similar to the introduced species in Florida. So these are different species of trees, but a similar story in reverse. These were quite narrow seed pods, and so these guys, of course, they didn't need big long beaks. Why are they going to drag those things around? They don't need them. So they had short beaks. Well, once again we had an introduced species. An introduced species flourish. That introduced species has that larger seed pod, and so exactly like you would expect, the beak size over a very, very short period of time has increased, or beak length has increased over less than 50 years in the Texas population. So we see different adaptations occurring based on what food is available. So we have this sort of temptation to think of this as the organism is changing, it's doing something to adapt. It's doing something to make itself better. But if you remember that this has to be standing genetic variation, this has to be something that's already present in the population. And those individuals who happen to have whatever the trait is that allows them to reproduce more, gives them more fitness, they're going to pass on those genes. And so then those genes are then going to get perpetuated and get perpetuated and get perpetuated. And we're going to come back to that in more detail in the next lecture. Another example, crop pest species. So over here on the y-axis, this is the number of species that are resistant to a given insecticide. On the bottom is the year. And if you look over at 1940, we can see that we're at 0. We didn't have insects, cropped pest species, resistant to insecticides. And I've just given you examples of a couple of specific insecticides. And in purple, we can see the number coming up to 100, close to 100 in 1920, then coming up more and more and more in 1980, the DDT, and then in 1990, 250 to 300 different species resistant to DDT. Look at the pattern for organophosphates in, what color is that? Orange. And then green is carbamates. And then the red is total for all of the different types, all of the different classes of insecticides. We can see that we started at 0 just in 1940. And then by 1990, over 500 different species had evolved resistance to various insecticides. This is an example of very rapid adaptation that we've been able to document. Okay, this one. Okay, next example is in a species of fish called Atlantic cod. And this is at I can't remember what they're called, a place where people go fishing, a specific place to go fishing, not just like a lake. And what we have happening here, what we're looking at, is for Atlantic cod, over on the left, is when did 50% of the population reach maturity. Bottom is the year, and then over on the right is body length. So as you're watching this plot take shape, think about if people are going fishing, what are they looking for? What are they going to be taking out, removing from the population? So this is body length. Body length is red. And we have a few peaks, but there's this very consistent decline in the average body length over the early years up till like 1995. Then looking at maturity, essentially how quickly do they mature? And again, we have this decline. It's getting lower, 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 and then we see a little bit of a recovery start around 1995. So when you think about fishing, if we're overfishing this population, then those individuals who grow fast, get big fast, those individuals who mature fast are going to be removed from the population, right? People want to catch those. They want the big fish. They remove them from the population. And so that means that those genes that confer fast, big growth, fast maturity, getting big fast, are getting removed from the population. They're not getting passed down to offspring. And what happens is when we see this sort of a little bit of a recovery start around 1995, is that around this time, the area stopped being able to be fished. I can't for the life of me remember what that silly thing is called. Hang on, I can tell you. Fishery, duh, it's called a fishery. So at where that white dotted line is, that's when they closed the fishery. And when that pressure stopped, when the fish that reached large sizes quickly stopped being removed, then the body size and rapid maturity started to recover. And so you can see very rapidly from 1975, not even quite to 1995, we see this very stark decline in body length and how rapidly the cod matured. Another example is bighorn sheep, and this is overhunting. And what we're looking at on the left axis is mean horn length, and on the y-axis, the x-axis is year. I didn't put numbers over here. I apologize. So we go from 40 here, 40, and this is in centimeters. And then at the very top is 80. That's 80 centimeters. 40 centimeters to 80 centimeters mean horn length, so the average horn length for the population. The individual dots are actual data points, and then the line is the trend line. So what's the trend over the course of this time period? So just from 1975 to 2005, we see that in this population that's being heavily hunted, and once again, hunters are looking for the bighorns, we see this stark decline in the length of the horns of bighorn sheep. And once again, that's because the individuals that have those big horns are being removed from the population. So those genes are being removed from the population. So what these are examples of adaptations. An adaptation is a characteristic that enhances the survival or reproduction of the organism that has it. Okay, enhances the survival or reproduction of the animal that has it. Okay. But what we need to think about, the survival or reproduction of the animal that has it, but relative to what? So that's going to be relative to those individuals that it's competing with. Remember when we talked about influences on Darwin, that competition for resources was one of the core things that helped him develop his theory of natural selection. So if we go back to our example of the soapberry bugs, you have variation in the population. You have long beaks and you have short beaks. Which of these is going to enhance the survival or reproduction of these soapberry bugs? I hope you thought, well, it depends on where they live. Do they live in Florida or do they live in Texas? So what these are, using our previous terminology, is the length of the beak. These are character states, right? And this increased survival or reproduction is in reference to other character states, so compared to other character states. And which character state confers increased survival or reproduction depends on what? It depends on the environment. It depends on the pressures that organism is experiencing, and that environment and those pressures are dynamic and they can change, just like we saw with the soapberry bugs. For a long time, that species was evolving on one type of tree with one type of seed pod. Then that changed, the environment changed, and suddenly the character state that was adaptive was different. Isn't that cool? So that is sort of an overview of adaptations. next, we're going to dig into the meat of how this happens. How do we get these adaptations? And so we're going to dig deeper into the concept of natural selection.